All right, we want to welcome in Andy Burcham as we continue our countdown to SEC Media Days, the voice of the Auburn Tigers. I don't even know, do you even like being called the voice of the Auburn Tigers, or do you embrace that? Because I know you love representing that university.
I do. I enjoy that role. It's a little odd for me to say that because Rod Bramblett was the voice for such a long time, and before that, Jim Fife, and those are the folks that those are the Auburn fans that the generations of folks listen to both Jim and Rod, and I guess I'm adjusting to that, but I truly enjoy the role that I'm in at this point now.
Boy, I got a chance to meet Jim Fife when I worked in Lexington, Kentucky. And then he gave me great advice when I was about to become the Alabama coaches show host for the first time. And I loved him and his style. Do you take any broadcast styles from Jim or Rod?
I think if you work with folks as long as we did, and I worked with Jim from 1990 until he passed away in 2003, and then Rod and I worked together for a quarter century. I think you take little bits of what they've done and perhaps incorporate that and maybe do it without, realizing that you are. For Jim, to me, it was his descriptive style and the way he would set up a broadcast and set up the scene of a big football game, especially a big football game, and how well. And he told me at one point that he looked to Jack Crystal, the longtime voice at Mississippi State, as someone that would describe the scene well. Eli Gold and I have had this conversation in the past about how well he describes the big scene with Alabama coming out of the locker room and how well he describes everything, the band, the weather, the uniforms that Alabama is wearing. So you just kind of take bits and pieces. But for me, the initial person that I tried to model a career after was the legendary Jack Buck in St. Louis. And I grew up 50 miles from St. Louis. I grew up when Jack Buck and Harry Carey were the voices of the Cardinals, the team that I grew up loving still to this day. And so those were the people that I listened to. I'm not sure I've ever modeled my style after any certain person, but I think when you work with someone, as long as I worked with Jim and certainly Rod, you kind of take a little bit of what they do, certainly appreciate how well they do it, and try and incorporate that into your style.
We didn't have a lot of money growing up, so I could pick up on a good night AM radio with Buck doing play-by-play, and I would sit outside and just dream of faraway places. And I know you were in the Midwest, but did listening on the radio take you to those faraway stadiums?
No question about it. And Camo X is the boomer station that you were listening to, 50,000 watt, one of those clear channel AM stations. I was only 50 miles away from St. Louis, and growing up as a kid, I didn't listen to top 40 music as a kid. I listened to Camo. I listened to talk radio and all of the shows that they had. And it influenced what I wanted to do for a career. And yeah, I mean, it took you to San Francisco. And at that point, the furthest place I'd ever been from Illinois was the Ozarks, Branson, Missouri. So that opportunity to go to San Francisco at Candlestick Park or Dodger Stadium or, to Pittsburgh or wherever. Yeah, it took you there. And, I think that's one of the romances, especially of radio, is that opportunity to go somewhere, just sitting on your front porch or in your bedroom listening to a late night Cardinal game on the West Coast.
For me, it was 11 because we couldn't get into games, and I noticed that Keith Jackson and everybody, Kurt Gowdy, were getting paid to go to games. What was it for you? Why did you want to get into being a broadcaster?
In 1967, the Cardinals beat the Red Sox in 7. And at that time, the Cardinals would put out, after a World Series win, they did it in 64, they did it in 67, they would put out an LP of highlights for the season. And it was narrated at that time by Harry Carey, but it was calls of Harry Carey and Jack Buck for the team that I grew up loving that had just won a World Series. And Dad brought home that LP, and I listened to that LP front and back all day long. I mean, all the time. And at age 6, I can truthfully tell you, I knew what I wanted to do with my career. Now, I didn't know what that would entail. And certainly my goal at that point as a 6-year-old was to be the next Harry Carey or Jack Buck, to be in that Cardinal press box. That didn't quite work out for me, but what has happened in my career, I would not trade it for anything. That's for certain.
Yeah, it is a thing of dreams, and now you're at a place that you spent your adult life at, and you're married, and you have this great family and friends around you. Tell me about representing Auburn, because anybody in the SEC, they I think respect the love Auburn people have for Auburn University, that town, that area of the state. And I hear that in you when I talk to you, but also in your broadcast. And I think that resonates with Auburn fans. So tell me, just when did you fall in love with Auburn?
I first came to Auburn in 1988 from Carbondale, Illinois. And my first Auburn event that I attended was Auburn, Tennessee in 1988. And I had never even been to a stadium as large as Jordan-Hare Stadium. And now my office is, I can look out the window and see Jordan-Hare. I'd never been to a stadium as large as Jordan-Hare. And I had never seen a Saturday event like an SEC football event. The tailgating and the pageantry. And at the time, Carl Stevens giving the 1 hour announcement, we're 1 hour away from Auburn versus Tennessee. I get chills remembering that moment, because I was already in the press box when Carl made that announcement. And I remember hearing people outside the stadium react to Carl's announcement. And I knew that this was going to be something special. And at that time, the only play-by-play I was doing for Auburn was women's basketball. Well, that was a good time to be working with women's basketball, because that was the second of 3 straight NCAA championship games for Auburn that I was getting to call. And I've worked in radio for every one of the commercial stations in this market. And you get to know people. You get to know the Auburn family. And although I'm not an Auburn alum, my wife received her bachelor's and her PhD at Auburn. And I talked to many student athletes, former student athletes in all sports at Auburn. And one question I try to ask them at some point of the interview is, what does Auburn mean to you? And Jim, I'm going to tell you, 99% of the people, the first thing they say is family.
Yep. And
it's probably different from each one about what family means to them. But the Auburn family is real. Now, is there dysfunction at Auburn and in this Auburn family? Tell me a family where there isn't, some dysfunction. But it is a true, I think it's beyond just a feeling. It's just the fact of Auburn family. And although I'm not an alum of this university, I understand what that means. I feel I'm part of that Auburn family, and I cherish that fact.
One of my first local television gig was in Birmingham, and I got to cover Auburn that year. And David Housel was in the press box when I arrived. I wanted to be early. I'd never covered a game. I'd never been to Auburn. I grew up in a Alabama family, and David Housel was so nice to me, showed me around the press box, actually took me down, showed me what we would do post game, and did the whole thing. And I remember calling my dad on a phone in the press box. It was still an hour and a half before kickoff, saying, "Dad, this is nothing like you have always told me it would be. This is it's the greatest place and the nicest people." I would do the radio on AM 1500 in Alabaster back for the Auburn broadcast. And David Housel would have a moment in the broadcast, if I remember correctly, where he would read one of his great writings leading into the game. And I get chills thinking about an Auburn, Georgia one about the fight that was coming, but it was a fight between family members. And I forget how he phrased it. I love David Housel's writings. Do you have any great David Housel stories, or do you love David Housel as much as I do? Oh. One of the great Auburn guys, I think.
He really is. And one of the things about David, and we just did a podcast with David right before his latest book from the back booth, The Chappies, that has just now come out. And he wrote a book several years ago. And I really thought at the time that every freshman that came in for Camp War Eagle should have received a paperback of that book, because it was history of Auburn. And it wasn't just Auburn University, and it wasn't just Auburn athletics. It was the day that the copper kettle blew up on a Sunday in downtown Auburn. He talked about in that, I believe, he talked about when they greased the rails, when Georgia Tech came to town and couldn't stop the train. It slid almost all the way to Lochapoka. Some great stories and some that I'd never heard about, but you learned about that. To me, David Housel is history. David Housel is Auburn history, not just for what he has done at Auburn, coming to Auburn as a student and working for the Plainsmen, going away and then coming back, and then working as sports information director, and then working his way up to athletic director. His life is a great story, but he also tells great stories, and he has that unique gift of writing and doing it incredibly well to this very day.
Do you ever get time to relax? It seems like your seasons bleed in, and then there's a quick summer, and now we're almost to SEC Media Days. Have you had a chance to relax? Do you finally feel like you've caught up to your new job now?
I do in some regards. That's kind of a two-part question to me. Yes, this is the time of the year where Jan and I can travel. The reason we got married in July of 2004, I told her, it's because it's the 1 month I can guarantee you that I'm not traveling calling a ball game. So July needs to be the month that we get married, because you never know how far Auburn's going to go, hopefully into the World Series in June. And everybody has played those August football games.
Yep.
So July is that 1 month that we get to travel. Just got back from the beach, as a matter of fact, and had a terrific time with our family down there. So, yeah, this is a time where we get to unwind a little bit, but you're never not preparing for the next season. You're never not looking at your spotting boards. How can I do this better? I've talked to several of the other play-by-play voices inside this league and outside this league. All right, how do you do this? How can I be better at this? I think you're always trying to improve, no matter how long you've done that. So you're always gearing up, and we're, in our business, you're always getting ready for that next season. And hopefully for 2021-22, we return to whatever normal that becomes, whether it's, full capacity for football, basketball, and baseball at Auburn, and all of the things that go into a football Saturday that we did not have a year ago. I mean, the parking lot here at Beard Eaves Coliseum, where our offices are, last year I parked on the front row right next to the stadium. You would never think about doing that in a normal season. There was no tailgating. There were no RVs in this parking lot every home game. I literally drove right to the front row and walked into the stadium and did the ball game and walked back out. And Sonny Smith and I did every away basketball game from Jordan-Hare Stadium, as many of the SEC voices did, whether it was a studio or in their booth at football or basketball or baseball. So I'm hoping that we return to traveling for every game, and at Auburn Arena, being right there in front of the jungle with all of that energy that comes with Auburn basketball. I'll be honest with you, Jim, I took that for granted. And it was just my second year as the voice. I took for granted what it is like to be on the sideline for a home basketball game. I took for granted the energy of Jordan-Hare Stadium on game day, or Bryant-Denny Stadium on game day, whatever, fighting through those tailgaters, walking from our parking lot to the stadium. I took that for granted. I will never take that for granted again.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Some of the saddest moments walking the stadiums last year when there was nobody, no tailgating going on. One of the things I love about your broadcast, and we talked about who influenced you, but I love the way you set up football plays. I love that. And I love the energy that you and Stan have. And I listen all the time, driving back and forth from games. Did you ever debate when you were becoming a play-by-play guy, whether you would be one of those guys who would who would be almost a fan behind the mic or try to do it like the network guy or share the emotions of the roller coaster ups and downs. I love the emotions that you guys bring to the broadcast. Was there ever a debate to sort of throttle that down? Do you have to throttle it down?
I think sometimes I will look back on a call and to myself will say, I really wish I had called that a little bit more down the middle. But Jim, that's who I am.
Yeah.
At a ball game. And I do think that's the Harry Carey in me coming out, because that's how he called games for the Cardinals or the Oakland A's or the White Sox, and of course for the Cubs before he passed away. And Jack Buck was almost the straight man to Harry Carey in the 60s. And then Jack Buck became the play-by-play voice. And I always enjoyed just how professional he was. He could get very excited about a play. And I wish I were more, at times I wish I were more Jack Buck than Harry Carey, but listen, that's who I am. And Stan and I really meshed well together in the booth 2 years ago. But remember this, Stan and I did games back in the day of pay-per-view and CSS and tape delay. That's where Stan and I worked together for the first time. And then when Charlie Trotman stepped away, now 21 years ago, Stan moved to that booth to work with Jim and then Rod, and then Stan and I kind of reunited now 2 seasons ago. So we had a little bit of chemistry already because we had done games together. Cole Kublik and I did a lot of games together before Cole branched out and now is, one of the top voices you're going to hear in college football, regardless of the network. So, and listen, I look back on a call that Rod made, I think his first of many iconic calls. For Rod, it was the 97 NCAA baseball tournament regional game down in Tallahassee. And David Ross, now the manager, of course, of the Chicago Cubs, hits that fabled walk-off home run against Florida State on a Saturday. And then the next day, Auburn goes to the World Series. And I listen to that call now. And from a technical standpoint, I don't think you teach someone how to call it that way. But that was just pure elation. There was no control in that call. And while some of me wishes we'd have been a little less cheerleader, the Auburn fans loved hearing that emotion. And there are still times where I wish I would throttle it back a little bit. There are times where I wish I wouldn't get on the officials as much as I do. That's a little bit of a struggle for me to try and call it more down the middle. I had this conversation with Mike Kelly, and Mike and I worked together in Carbondale when he was in school and I was working for WCAL, working for a man, Mike Reese, who has been the voice of SIU athletics for now almost 40 years. An outstanding broadcaster. I probably learned more radio and more sportscasting from Mike Reese than anybody else. And Mike Kelly has been the longtime voice at Missouri. And he and I were talking a couple years ago in Columbia before an Auburn, Missouri basketball game, my first year taking over for Rod. And we were talking, and I was talking about officials and how I was at times struggling not to just lose it on the officials. And he said, Jack Buck, because he worked with Jack Buck at KMOX. He said, Jack Buck once told me, he said, call the game. Call the game. Don't get on the officials. If it's part of the game, you talk about it, but you don't harp on it. Call the game. And we have a laminated card that Brad Law, our producer, puts up right in front of my face for every broadcast that we do. And all it is CTG. And it's just my reminder to call the game. It doesn't always work, but the reminder is there.
If I wanted it down the middle, I won't speak for Auburn fans, but if I wanted it down the middle, I'd turn on the broadcast on ESPN. I turn into local broadcasts to hear the emotions of college athletics, and I think you get it with play-by-play. Man, I appreciate the time, and look forward to seeing you in the fully vaccinated full stadiums this upcoming season. And you're one of a kind, and we're so happy for your success, and we appreciate you being with us, Andy.
Jim, thank you, and I wish you guys the best in this new venture. You and I were talking before. I've always enjoyed your show. I love the entertainment value of it, how well it's done. I wish I could do live reads as well as you guys. You guys do live reads better than anyone I've ever heard.
We get about 27 to 30 every 4 hours, so we get a lot of practice.
Well, you do it well, and I wish you nothing but the best as well. Thank you, bud.
Well, thank you.